Welcome to Get Paid for Your Pad, the definitive show on Airbnb hosting, featuring the best advice on how to maximize profits from your Airbnb listing, as well as real-life experiences from Airbnb hosts all over the world. Welcome.
Get paid for your pad. 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 Get paid for your pad.
Don't wait for the day after check-in to get paid. Visit payfully.co to learn how to get paid months in advance for your upcoming bookings on Airbnb, VRBO, and other platforms. That's payfully.co.
This week in the world of Airbnb, welcome everybody. I'm here with Mr. Glenn Carter, the head of marketing of Hostfully. Glenn, welcome.
Hey Jasper, how you doing? How's Panama?
It's warm. It's very warm. I'm about to go on a little adventure in the next couple of weeks, renting a car and driving through the whole country. I've never been outside of the city here, so it's going to be very interesting. I'm going to do some kite surfing and hopefully see some exotic animals as well in the jungle.
Cool. So you're renting a car and driving through the entire country or different countries?
That's the plan.
That's the plan.
I don't know if you can take a rental car to another country. I tried it once in Mexico. I tried to drive into Belize, but then they stopped me and they said it wasn't allowed.
All right. Well, yeah, maybe stay in country so you don't get arrested.
Yeah, that sounds like a good plan. Well, there's quite sorry, what?
Oh, no, I was just going to say I'm warming up myself. We took a trip down to Florida from Ottawa, Canada. So we're escaping the winter and enjoying the nice white sandy beaches here in Destin.
That's a very wise decision. I was in France a couple of weeks ago skiing, and it was like minus 20. And then I flew directly to Panama, and I went from minus 20 to like plus 30. So that was a nice little temperature shock.
Yeah, you need it sometimes, especially this time of year.
I definitely prefer the heat over the cold. I've came to that conclusion many times, actually.
Even the extreme heat of plus 30?
When it's really hot, you can still go outside and you're in the air conditioning. It's okay. I guess you can do that too. If it's cold, you can go outside and it's warm. But still, like, I enjoy being outside. The heat doesn't bother me so much outside. It only bothers me at night when I go to sleep. But then there's always, the air conditioning.
Yeah, I guess if you're kite surfing, you need the heat anyway. We tend to hibernate in Canada during the winter, so that's our solution to that problem.
Yeah. I tried kite surfing in Holland too, in April when the water was still really cold, and that wasn't very pleasant either. It's like my feet were freezing. I couldn't move my fingers. I literally couldn't move my toes until like about half an hour after I quit.
What was the temperature?
I don't know. It was cold.
Lesson learned then.
Lesson learned. Let's talk Airbnb. Let's start with something fun. 10 facts about Airbnb that you wouldn't otherwise know. Well, I don't know if that's true. I definitely knew some of the facts. It's always fun to look at some facts and see how everything is going in terms of numbers. Let's see. Let's just pick the interesting ones. There's more than 4.5 million Airbnb listings right now in 81,000 cities around the world. Airbnb hosts have earned $41 billion in 10 years. In 2017, the biggest night was when approximately 3 million people stayed in Airbnbs around in 20,000 cities around the world. Oh yeah, in 2008, roughly 400 guests checked into Airbnb listings. So that was the year that they started. Now, 400 guests check into Airbnb listings every 2 minutes. So that's what's changed in the scope of 10 years.
I like the total number that Airbnb hosts have earned. The $41 billion over the last 10 years is very interesting to me. Another one, too, is, amidst this backdrop of the ongoing debate about whether Airbnb is good for communities, one of the facts here is that Airbnb guests spent $6.5 billion in restaurants in 44 cities between September 2016 and September 2017. So in just 1 year, Airbnb guests brought in that kind of money into just these 44 cities. Whether those guests would have stayed in a hotel, a lot of them probably would have and still spent the money, but it just goes to show that the tourism industry is now heavily reliant on short-term rentals.
Yeah, and I guess if you stay in a hotel, you're probably going to spend the money in different restaurants, right? A lot of hotels have restaurants on the property, on site. And also the hotels are typically, they're usually concentrated in a few neighborhoods, right? A few central neighborhoods, whereas the Airbnbs are more spread out throughout the whole city. So I'm thinking that, of course, if you stay in a hotel, you still need to eat. But then at the same time, you're probably going to spend your money in the more well-known restaurants, the hotel restaurants, etc. So I think for the small restaurants in the residential neighborhoods, it's probably a good thing.
Yeah, for the smaller mom and pop restaurants, absolutely. I think that's completely correct. Another one that I liked is it said in 2009, 57% of Airbnb guests were from the US. 8 years later, in 2017, only 29% of those guests were from the US. So that really goes to show that Airbnb's international expansions have been successful. It's not necessarily a US-centric platform anymore. I mean, less than a third now are US. I found that very interesting, and it shows that their expansion efforts have been wildly successful.
Yeah, and also most of the biggest Airbnb markets are not even in the US. I remember making a list of the top 10 Airbnb markets. I think one was Paris. I think London was in there. I think there was only 2 American cities, actually. I think it was New York and Los Angeles that were in the top 10. So definitely that also shows that it's not just the US, it's a worldwide phenomenon.
Yeah, and with the growth ambitions into China as well, I think it'd be interesting to see that number in a year or two from now.
Absolutely. Let's see. We have an article, there's another study that has been done about the effect of Airbnb, and more specifically, what did Airbnb do to New York City? And there's been studies about this before. The complaints against Airbnb are in 2 categories, right? There's when the guests misbehave, and then secondly, it's the effect that Airbnb has on neighborhoods, right? They're saying like increasing rents, they're saying houses are being taken off the residential market, they're saying that the neighborhoods change. There's less coherence because of all the tourists that are flocking to certain neighborhoods. There's been studies done before, but now there's another one by Mr. David Wachsmuth, I don't know if I've pronounced that right, but he's a professor of urban planning at McGill University. And of course, also these studies are always financed by the hotel industry, so you always have to wonder how accurate they are if they're not biased. To summarize the article, they're saying that rents have risen in New York by about %. They're also saying that anywhere between 0 and 4% of the houses have been taken off the residential market and are being used for Airbnbs. So 0 to 4%. The other conclusion, I think there was one more conclusion. I kind of lost it now.
Yeah, no worries. As you mentioned, this is David Wachsmuth from McGill University in Montreal, where I am. There are issues with the study. I mean, you mentioned that, it was funded by the New York City Hotel Trades Council. So I'll let your listeners take a guess of what side of the debate they're on. The big issue for me is, the study uses estimates of Airbnb activities from AirDNA. I absolutely love AirDNA. I use it. But there are issues with how AirDNA scrapes its data, and Airbnb has been quick to point this out. It can actually overcount the number of nights per year people actually stay because it accounts for periods of time that hosts have blocked off as unavailable. So if you're renting out your primary residence and you block off a month because you have someone else staying with you or you don't want it rented out that time, AirDNA will count that as booked time. So using AirDNA data, and this study uses 80 million data points from the entirety 20 million population of the New York City metro area. So that's quite a big data scrape. If you have that little discrepancy, that's going to make a big difference in your data. But just to point out, the study found that 12% of Airbnb hosts in New York City are what they call commercial operators, which is they have multiple home listings. So again, as someone who's 2 properties, rents out their primary residence and then has 1 rental property, are they really a commercial operator? I would debate that. There's discrepancy in Airbnb's own data with that, where they say 92% of the hosts in New York City were sharing their primary residence, and 79% of hosts, they said, use that money to stay in their homes just because New York City is such an expensive market. And we have that issue in Canada as well with Toronto, where people have to rent out a basement suite or a room just to be able to afford the expensive rental market. So there's a bunch of issues with this study, and it's unfortunate because we need this type of data, we need this type of discussion. But when it's funded by the hotel industry, automatically you're questioning the intention of the piece. But one positive note is that the study did find that Airbnb, there's a direct correlation with community gentrification in Airbnb rentals. So at the very least, the study shows that the advent of Airbnb in New York City has gentrified a lot of neighborhoods of New York City, secondary neighborhoods, outside of the Brooklyn and Manhattan, and contributed to those local businesses that are sort of the mom and pop shop businesses of those particular areas.
Yeah, and if you look at the conclusions, then they don't seem that unrealistic to me. I think, medium rent increase attributable to Airbnb growth over a 3-year period. So the study looked at 2014 to 2017. I mean, a 1% increase in rents because of Airbnb doesn't seem out of the ordinary to me. I mean, you would expect rents to go up slightly because of Airbnb at least, right? I think generally it's being overemphasized. People are saying, oh, the rents are going up like crazy because of Airbnb, but it's, 1% is not really that much, right? Over 3 years. And then also, the amount of houses that are being, taken off the market. I mean, in most neighborhoods, it's very low. It's like less than 1%. There's only a couple neighborhoods where it's more like, between 2 and 4%. Combine that with the fact that they're also pointing out that there are positive effects of Airbnb. It kind of makes me think that this guy, although it was funded by the hotel industry, it kind of makes me feel like he probably did do like a pretty good job of being objective.
Yeah, it's helpful to hear the actual conclusions of the report he doesn't just slam Airbnb, which is positive. So it'd be interesting to see this study replicated in other markets. New York is sort of its own beast in terms of rentals, sky high rents and property prices. It's a world-class city. So what's good for New York, what applies to New York is not necessarily the majority of Airbnb markets. So it'd be interesting to see this study done, replicated across, secondary US cities and European cities, just to see if the same conclusions hold water. And then to do a pre and post regulation study as well, like in cities that are implementing these Airbnb restrictions, how has that contributed to the rental market? Because it will certainly have an effect, whether positive or negative.
Right. And to finalize the discussion of this topic, he does 3 recommendations in the conclusion of the study. First of all, he recommends the one host, one home policy, which is already being implemented. Secondly, and this is kind of a little bit surprising to me and also kind of shows me that the study is quite objective. The second recommendation is to relax the restrictive multiple dwellings law and actually legalize short-term rentals for fewer than 30 days, at least for a certain amount of days per year. So he recommends, maybe 30 or 60 or 90 days, just like in Amsterdam, London, and Paris. Seems like a reasonable conclusion to me. So out of all the studies I've seen, I feel like this one, although it's been funded by the hotel industry, is actually a fairly good one, other than the question marks that you've raised in terms of the data, of course.
I think that the hotel industry is seeing the writing on the wall that, short-term rentals are here to stay. It's just how we regulate them. And I think most cities have agreed to sort of primary residence sharing. So I think the hotel industry is resigned to the fact that this is here to stay. And, we might as well learn to work with it as opposed to continue fighting it.
Absolutely. And it seems like a lot of cities are moving towards the limit on the amount of nights that you can do Airbnb. I just saw an article as well that's talking about Geneva and Switzerland, where they want to put the 60 days a year rental limit into place. So yeah, we'll see where this is going. But New York is like you said, it's like a big market. There's always a lot of debate going on. There's multiple politicians, suggesting different type of laws and stuff. So there's always a lot going on the regulatory front.
Airbnb has changed the way people rent forever. But actually getting paid is still a pain. That's where Payfully comes in. Payfully is a safe and secure way to get paid for your upcoming reservations within 24 hours of them being booked. Payfully deposits directly into your bank account, with funds typically available within 24 hours. Payfully works with all the major platforms, Airbnb, VRBO, Guesty and others. They've helped thousands of hosts expand their business, cover unexpected expenses, and stabilize their income. Visit payfully.co for your first request free with code GPFYP. That's payfully.co, promo code GPFYP.
Okay, so we all know that Airbnb is probably not going to IPO this year. And of course, there's a lot of employees, especially the employees that started at Airbnb in the first few years of the company's existence, who probably have a lot of stock or options on stock. For those people, it's really profitable when there's an IPO, because then you can sell those shares and the value of the shares go up a lot on an IPO, typically. Now that Airbnb isn't going to IPO, more and more of these employees are actually leaving Airbnb. And so this article in Bloomberg talks about a guy named Riley Newman. He's an executive who started his own venture capital firm called Wave Capital. And their plan is to kind of fund startups that are being started by ex-Airbnb employees. So the article talks about a VC fund wants to create an Airbnb mafia. It's kind of a funny headline.
A bit of a sensational headline, but this is a pretty interesting article because it sort of touches on, as you mentioned, the IPO issue that Brian Chesky has said that, Airbnb is not going public in 2018, but, what the future holds is anyone's guess. But as we know, startup entrepreneurs are notoriously restless. So we've had the quiet departure of quite a few of the original employees at Airbnb who are holding on to their original equity stake. And, Riley Newman was one of the first 10 employees at Airbnb. Wave Capital, its mission is to fund former Airbnb employees who are doing other stuff. I think it's great. I was reading this article and thinking back to, the early days of the early founders, the network of founders from PayPal who left the company, Peter Thiel and Elon Musk and those guys and founded their own thing. So I think we'll see a similar wave of early Airbnb employees going out and doing pretty impressive things because obviously they have a lot of experience and they're a part of something that changed the way people rent out their homes.
And two notable startups that have already been started by ex-Airbnb employees. Coinbase, the cryptocurrency exchange, was founded by Brian Armstrong, who worked for 2 years as a software engineer at Airbnb. And database company Mesosphere was started by Florian Leibert, who also spent time with Airbnb. Now, with the start of Wave Capital, we might see more of those in the future. Did you hear about the story where there's this guy in Nashville who listed his house for a maximum of 22 guests?
No.
Okay. Well, it's kind of funny. This guy just put 10 beds in his living room or something, and then he just listed his house and put a maximum of 22 guests. And the neighbors were getting a little bit concerned seeing groups of over 20 people walk into the house. And so they complained, and now he changed it, and now it's listed for 12 guests. Just a funny little story in between. Let's see what else. Airbnb hired a African-American woman, Cassidy Blackwell, to advance global policy goals. I think Airbnb has faced some criticism in the past over the fact that they weren't hiring a lot of women and they weren't hiring a lot of people from minority groups. And so I don't know if that played a role in this particular hire. But anyway, they've hired this woman, so we'll see if they keep doing it in the future. Oh, there's another story. Airbnb Premium. Investors will pay 2 to 3% more for short-term rental properties. So if you have a home and you want to put it on the market and you can show that you've had an active Airbnb history, then apparently investors are willing to pay about 2 to 3% more for your house, which I kind of feel is not that much.
No, definitely not that much. And I'm sure that'll increase in the future as we prove your revenue, because I know at least on the long-term rental side, you can charge quite a bit more if you can, prove that you have had renters in there for a certain amount of time and you're, maintaining a certain level of cash flow. Providing Airbnb receipts with your rental for sale is likely to increase that value. Now, maybe it's because in a lot of cities, we're just coming to terms with the regulations and the legality of it. So I think once that dust settles, we'll have a much better idea of how you can sort of advertise your Airbnb income legitimately.
And GM is planning to start an Airbnb for cars. So there's already a couple car sharing platforms out there. There's Turo, there's GetAround, and potentially also Tesla is looking into a similar service. But now GM is planning to launch a car sharing business. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's super interesting. I mean, I've used Turo and I've heard of GetAround. I think it's a great model. You're never too late to the game. I think they're the first major car company to do this, although I think it was Ford who had partnered with Turo or GetAround, one or the other. The GM Maven platform has been around for a bit now. They're just extending it, so I never used it, but I believe you could rent out a GM vehicle from a dealership for a couple hours like you would on Turo or GetAround. They're extending this to allow owners of GM vehicles to use Maven to rent out their vehicle to people in their community or tourists or whatever. It's exactly the same as Turo if anyone's used that. So I think it's very interesting. And I think, going forward, this type of model is only likely to gain more traction as, car ownership is reducing. Car loans is quite a huge issue in the US, as you probably know, with car ownership on the decline and driverless cars in the rearview window, pun intended. I think, these car sharing platforms are only going to become more and more utilized by people.
Yeah, it's interesting to see that Turo has grown quite a bit. It's grown fivefold in recent years. To car listings has tripled to 200,000. I guess there's 5 million users on the platform. But still, they raised 92 million in September, and it's now valued at about 700 million. So considerably smaller than Airbnb, of course, but still 700 million. That's a pretty big valuation. Getaround raised 45 million last April, where Toyota Motors invested in them. So it seems like the car sharing platforms are definitely doing well. It's still relatively small, but I remember when they first came about, a lot of people were very skeptical. They were saying like people don't want other people to drive their cars. You know, the car is a very precious belonging for a lot of people. It's kind of like a baby, and they don't want other people driving it. But it seems like they're getting some momentum.
Well, it's the exact same arguments that people used in the early days of Airbnb. You know, no one wants to rent out their home to strangers. Why would you do that?
Exactly. Yeah, that's true. It takes a while before these type of things change, you know, before people start thinking differently and seeing their property and their belongings as kind of tied to their identity, but more as just something that you can use in order to either get from A to B or to have a roof above your head and not be in the rain.
Yeah, exactly. It's an asset that you can leverage to earn some supplemental income, and there's nothing wrong with that. And good on GM for getting ahead of the curve, even though there's Turo out there. You know, I think Turo just raised last year almost $100 million in their Series D round, and they've acquired a couple other startups. So they're really solidifying their position as the leader in this space. But competition is always good. And I think GM they're not just a startup, right? So they have the wherewithal to have a go at it. Maybe they'll extend it beyond GM vehicles in the future. So this is a pretty interesting development in the whole car sharing world.
Awesome. And with that, we come to the end of this episode. So Brett, thank you for joining me. And of course, thanks to all the listeners for tuning in. And I hope to see you next time.
Get paid for your pad. 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 Get paid for your pad.